Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Thank you for joining us, and we're looking forward to having a great session with everyone tonight. Our presenters this evening are Indivoyo Masia and Werner Meyer. Masia is currently completing his master's in systems engineering at WITS, with some of his research focusing on behavioral biases that affect projects. He holds a BSc in industrial engineering and is a certified associate in project management. For the past 5 years, Masia has been a consultant at Project Link, and he's worked on a range of mining projects. Werner, our other speaker, is a director at Project Link with over 24 years of experience in project and program and portfolio management. He holds a PhD in project management and a BSc honors in mathematics and statistics. Over the years, Werner has worked across a variety of industries, helping organizations build practical and effective project management capabilities. So now that I've given them a brief introduction, I'm going to hand over to Werner to kickstart with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Cyan, and good evening, everybody. We're really glad to have you here tonight to listen to us. And in this webinar, we are going to talk about several human factors that impact on project planning, and we are specifically going to look at how those factors can sometimes lead to low quality planning, and that is often the result of our own biases and our behavior, and not so much about external factors. And to just introduce you to what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to tell you a short story about a train that has been going off the rails for several years, and what we can learn from that project. Then we're briefly going to look at two definitions, which would be important for our discussion tonight, just to make sure that we all speak the same language. We're then going to talk about three very specific human behaviors. Two of them are biases, and the one is just a consequence of some biases. And the first one is, which I call believe in yourself, optimism bias. Then the second one is uniqueness bias, which is about thinking that your project and the work that you're doing is unique. And then we're going to talk about little lies and big lies. And this has to do with misrepresentation of facts when we do projects, and how people sometimes lean on biases and heuristics to misrepresent certain information to get their projects to go ahead. And then finally, we're going to introduce you to three very specific areas that we picked on how we can improve, that we've seen from research can actually improve the situation quite substantially, especially about human behavior and doing better planning. At the end of this presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So Masia and I are going to go through it. We're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to speak first about the train story and optimism, and then Masia is going to take you through the other two areas. Okay, so to start off with, in October 2008, the state of California embarked on a project to build a high-speed rail system that stretches from Los Angeles, and you can see on the map, from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And that rail authority called this a transformative investment in the future of transportation, promising faster, cleaner, and more reliable travel. The network would stretch for 790 kilometers, and it would reduce the travel time from Los Angeles to San Francisco from 9 hours to 2 hours and 40 minutes. So there's a big improvement there. So when they started the project in 2008, their estimate was $33.2 billion, and their estimated completion date would have been 2020. Then by 2012, they had upped that number to 53 billion. And now the revised completion date was actually 2028. And then by 2014, just before the actual kickoff of the project, the estimate was already sitting at 58.66 billion US dollars. And that was the groundbreaking. So just at the end of 2014, they actually kicked off the project. But soon thereafter, things started to escalate. Initially, it went down very slightly in 2016, and then by 2018, the cost for the whole project had gone up to 77 billion, and now their revised completion date was 2033, but that was only for a small portion. And you can see on the map there's a portion marked in black, and that's the portion. So they had reduced the scope of work for 2023, but the total project cost was already sitting at 77 billion. And then by 2020, it was at 83 billion. And then by 2022, they were sitting at 93 billion. And now the revised estimate, which was also a bit doubtful, was 2050 to complete the whole project. The last estimate that they had was last year, and that was for 106 billion, and they had not completed that initial operating section yet. So we can see this project did not go well for them, and there are many things that went wrong on this project. So in the analysis, and of course, this kind of project that goes badly like this gets investigated, it gets studied by the government and by external bodies. And there are 5 key factors that they've listed so far. And remember, this thing has not been completed yet. They're still busy. They're still burning money on this project. And there are 5 challenges that they identified. And the first one was about land acquisition, not getting the land where they thought they were going to build this railway line. And there were all sorts of legal issues around that. The second one was utility relocation. So as they were building this railway line, they had to relocate electricity, stormwater, etc. And that was a big issue as well, which led to delays and additional cost. Then there were funding uncertainties, but those funding uncertainties mainly came from the fact that they were spending more money than what they had planned initially. So that's where the uncertainties came from, because people didn't want to spend the money, or the government didn't want to spend the money. Then there were legal challenges specifically related to the land acquisition. And then the last one is they said, there's been a lot of management and planning issues on this project. But if we just look at some of those reasons, the first 2 reasons are actually core to the delay, because they are preventable things, in the sense that when you're doing project planning, those are typically the kind of things that shouldn't be surprises, because you know where this railway line is going to run, and you can do some study work in advance to understand what the issues are there. So if they had done proper planning, then it's highly likely that they wouldn't have picked up on, or that they would have picked up on those 2 issues, and it would have alleviated many of the legal challenges and, of course, the funding uncertainties. So this project had problems from the very beginning. Oh, sorry, I just want to scroll a bit fast there. Sorry about that. So from the very beginning, one of the first comments that was actually made when they started the project by the Reason Foundation was there's questionable ridership projections and cost assumptions, and virtually no objective analysis about the risk and uncertainties were done. That was the Reason Foundation. And then secondly, if people knew, so this was Willie Brown, the former mayor of San Francisco, he said, if people knew the real cost from the start, nothing would ever be approved. And that's a common thing that we see. And Messiah is going to talk about that a little bit later. The third comment here is the project is way underfunded, and we're never going to be able to finish it. Sometimes you have to cut your losses, and it's time to cut our losses. So that was said by one of the senators, Brian Dahl, in the US. And then finally, and I think the best comment was from earlier this year, when Donald Trump looked at this and he said, this is the worst managed project I have ever seen. It's impossible that something could cost that much. Okay, so, and I think what actually plays out here is in the corner there, you'll see that quote, which is called Hofstede's Law. And I think it's very apt here in this situation, because it states that it always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstede's Law. Okay, so that is something, if you've ever done project planning, you've been involved in projects and so on, I think that would resonate with you, because that tends to be one of the issues that we quite frequently find, is that we know things are going to, things take longer, but instead of knowing that, we still plan for things not to take longer. Okay, so that can be quite problematic. So 2 of the definitions that we want to have a look at here tonight, and that we are going to discuss. The first is heuristics, And a heuristic is a mental shortcut our brain takes to quickly get to a decision. For example, imagine a primitive caveman walking in the dark and he hears a growl behind him. The mental shortcut of running instead of investigating what is behind him is a useful tool to have because your survival depends on that. So these heuristics are mental shortcuts. We don't think a lot. The brain makes a very quick decision to do something, but sometimes those decisions are not that accurate, but they sometimes would save our lives. The second is biases. So biases, or a bias, is a distortion of our judgment. It's a systematic pattern of deviation from a norm or a rational argument. For example, we get something called confirmation bias, and that is the notion of giving preference to information that suits our arguments. And I'm sure many of you have actually dealt with that. We also get optimism bias, which we'll discuss in a bit more detail. And it lets people think that they are sometimes better dancers than they actually are. And they tend to do this, especially after they've had a few beers. They become really good dancers. Okay, so those are two of the terms that we're going to use, heuristics and biases. What we also want you to do before we get into the actual heuristics and the biases we want to discuss tonight, we want you to do a very quick poll or a small test. And Cyan is going to post the link. There's a website that we'd like you to go to. It takes about 2 minutes. I'll put 3 minutes, but on the website, you'll see it says 2 minutes. And in this poll, this is called the life orientation test. And it's an interesting test. We'll discuss the details after you've completed that. But when you open that link, you'll see there are 2 options. And if you can pick the second option and just complete the test, there are only 10 questions. It should take you 1 minute or 2 minutes at most to do that. And what I also want to ask you is, as you complete that, just to post your results in the chat if you want, just so we get an idea of where people are pitching. Okay, so I'm going to look at my watch, and if we can start now, I'll give you 3 minutes. So I've got 18:45. So at 18:48, we'll recommence. And Cyan has probably posted that. I can't see the chat right now, but I'm sure she's posted that. And let's get going with that. So you've got 3 minutes to complete that quickly. So I just want to ask those people who joined just now, saw 1 or 2 people coming in. There's a link in the chat of a little test that we'd like you to do. Only 10 questions. Should take you a minute and a half or so to do. And we've already communicated that to everyone else. And you've got another 1 minute and 50 seconds to complete that. And as you complete that, if you can please post your results in the chat. We just want to get an idea of where people are pitching. And this will lead us into the next discussion, just to give you an idea of where you are standing in the world of heuristics and biases. Okay, so we've got another 1.5 minutes to go. Okay, you've got about 40 seconds left. But of course, you can complete it even if we restart. I'm just giving you 3 minutes to complete that. But I see a few interesting scores. Anything, I think the highest I've seen is 20. That's very optimistic. And then the lowest is 8. The 9 also. So let's see how things go. Okay, so the 3 minutes are up, so I'm going to continue. And yeah, I think there's a wide spread. I think most people are above 15 if I just scan through these answers. And for those of you who joined late, there's a link in the chat higher up now that you can complete. It's only 10 questions to do a small test that we want. Well, you're not going to use the results, but we want you to reflect on yourself when you look at that. Okay, so let's continue. And what you would have seen is at the end of the test, there's a score. And if you score 13 or below, that indicates that you are relatively pessimistic. So your outlook on life as it is at the moment is more pessimistic. A score of 18 or actually above 18, 19 and higher indicates that you're optimistic, and anything between 14 to 18 means it's sort of in the middle. Now, what I want to do in the next few slides is just look at optimism, because this test that you just completed is very much about optimism and how optimistic you are. And the interesting thing about optimism is that as humans, we are pretty much hardwired in terms of our optimism. And so optimism bias is a cognitive bias that causes a person to believe that they are less at risk of experiencing a negative event compared to other people. Right, so that's a textbook definition and how we look at that. And there's some research that I want to share with you. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see the citation. Now, what these researchers did is they investigated optimism bias just to see how people change their optimism when they are presented with certain information. So what they did is they actually presented people with a set of questions of things that could happen to them. And then they would ask the person, what do you think the likelihood is that this would happen to you? And the person would give a score. And then, and a bit later on, they will actually test that again after presenting them with actual information. So the one example I want to show you here is one of the questions they asked people is, what is the likelihood that you would get cancer? And let's say, for example, the first estimate the person gave was 40%. They are then presented with the actual data or statistics for their demographic. And if the actual was lower, and in this case 30% for a particular demographic, then they look at the adjustment that the person would make if they are presented with the same question. And what they saw is if people scored themselves higher and the actual value is lower, and that lower value is a good value, good news value, then they would make large adjustments. So in this case, the average for cancer went down to 31%. So it's quite close to what the actual value was. However, if a person estimated low and they then presented with the actual information, then their next estimate would still be quite low, relatively low, because they're optimistic, because they think, okay, well, this is not going to happen to me, so that they don't believe the demographic information. So the idea here was that if we are presented with negative information or negative feedback, we tend not to accept that. But if it's positive, we tend to embrace that and we prepare to make adjustments. So they took this experiment further. And from previous research, it was determined that in the human brain, there are two areas here on the sides of your head, which are called the inferior frontal gyrus, or the IFG. And what they can do, and this is something you should not try at home, what they can do, they can actually disable that using an electromagnet, as you see on the picture a bit lower down. So they've got this device with an electromagnet, and then they would actually radiate or expose that area of the brain to the electromagnet. The electromagnet can actually be focused on a particular area. And doing that would disable that part of the brain or disrupt it for half an hour or so. So it recovers, but for a period of time, it disables that. So then they completed this test. So that technique is called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Then they would ask people questions, and the control sample, where people were not radiated on the left or the right-hand side, we see that the update when they get good news is quite big, so that's the blue bar. And the update that people make in their predictions about themselves would be lower if they receive bad news. However, when the left-hand side of the IFG is disabled, then this thing actually flips around. So people would make larger adjustments on the bad news and smaller adjustments on the good news. So this actually messes with their optimism. And then if it's done on the right-hand side, people become even more optimistic. So the blue bar is higher and the bad news is even lower than what it was before. And the real takeaway from this experiment is that humans are actually hardwired. We're neurologically hardwired to be optimistic. It's not just something we do, it's actually something we are, or an individual would be. And how this plays out in the project world is quite interesting. And of all the biases, and there's about 200 biases that have been identified. As a matter of fact, one of the biases that have been identified is the bias to call everything a bias, but we're not going to talk about that. But one of the most prevalent biases in project planning is optimism bias. So let's look at a few examples of how this plays out. So one example here is when estimating project cost, and we quite frequently see this, that estimators or planners or project teams would use ideal labor and procurement rates. So when you have to put together the estimate, people tend to say, you know, we should plan on the best case. We're going to get the cheapest labor. We're going to get the best rates from our suppliers, and then they will plan according to that. Now, this is even aggravated more if the project sponsor sets a target budget. For example, if the sponsor says this project must be done in $100 million, then lo and behold, that estimate, especially if the sponsor is not a very pleasant person, lo and behold, that estimate will come in within that budget or in the time frame. So there's a big role there that gets played by optimism bias, because we look at those numbers and we can actually justify them. We can say, but we have seen low labor rates and we have seen low procurement rates, so it is possible. But if it's not always going to be low. There are reasons why these things were high at some point in the past. Another example is a construction team creates a project schedule, and they make an assumption that all the permits, the material, the weather, etc., all of those conditions will align perfectly, because of course that's going to give you a very optimistic schedule. When the permitting goes according to plan, and we often know it does not. When the materials arrive, when they have to arrive, when the weather plays along. So it's unlikely that all of those things will play in your favor every time. So that's also how optimism bias plays out. Perhaps the last one here is where the project manager, and I've heard this so many times, where the project manager says, we've learned from the last time. And they cut the contingency on the budget, on the schedule, but they forget that the previous 3 last times, they made the same mistakes. They were late and over budget, but they haven't actually learned. So they don't have a history of learning from their mistakes. But this time around, they're really going to learn. Okay, so that's a big issue. So just to take that a little bit further, in the United Kingdom, they have actually incorporated optimism bias into their project management. And they have something that they call His Majesty's Treasury Supplement Green Book Guidance on Optimism Bias. And one of the tables in this book actually gives these numbers here. And these are adjustments that they make when they do projects, or that they can make when they do projects. And I'll just take one example here. For civil engineering, for example, they say the work's duration, so the schedule, due to optimism bias, can typically be anything from 1 to 20% longer. And on the budget, anything from 3 to 44%. So you can see those are significant numbers, and they can all be attributed from the research and the historical information that they have about past projects they have done. So optimism bias plays a significant role, and it can also be quantified by putting it into the project, forcing project teams to actually look at optimism bias and to consider that. Okay, so that's as far as I'm going to talk about the biases. I'm going to hand over to Messiah to take us through the next 2 behavioral issues that we find on project teams. Messiah.
Thank you so much, Werner, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk about one of the biases that's quite common in project management. But before I talk about it, let's first describe what it is. So this uniqueness bias was originally identified by psychologists as the tendencies of individuals to see themselves as singular than they actually are. So this is similar to someone thinking that they are an exceptional driver. They don't make mistakes on the roads. They're better than average, even when the stats suggest otherwise. But in the context of project management, it's actually the tendencies of planners and project managers to see their projects as singular, as unique. And in the following study, we will look at how these bias can manifest in our projects. A study actually showed that project managers often see their project as unique, and this is not by any coincidence. This is simply because project managers are actually primed, they're trained to see their projects as unique. And in fact, according to one of the biggest professional organizations, the PMI, it describes the project as a temporary undertaking to create a unique product, service, or result. However, I think we actually maintain that understanding of projects as unique, it's actually unfortunate because it contributes to uniqueness bias with project planners and managers. So basically, it makes us view our projects as exceptional, thereby enhancing optimistic projection and often ignoring historical data and experiences. So in the next slide, we're going to look at some of the examples where these bias can manifest. So, for example, if you take a look at the Apollo moon landing project, I think all of us can agree that that was quite a unique venture. Landing a man on the moon was never done before. But actually, the management of NASA came out and say, despite the apparent uniqueness of the project, we've got existing knowledge and resources that are actually not quite unique. So I think what we can learn is that learning from history is actually very critical. So it's always important to learn from history. So there's another example that I'm going to look at that Werner actually discussed, which is the California high-speed rail. So that project was actually unique in California. California has never built a high-speed rail line before. So in a sense, the authority was actually managing a unique project. But there are other many projects that have been built around the world with data and lesson learned that would have been highly valuable to California. I think the most important thing that we can take from this slide is that truly unique projects are actually rare. We can always learn from previous projects. There is actually a famous quote by Margaret, which says that always remember that you are absolutely unique, just like everyone else. And I think that serves as a reminder that even though we are special, we have a lot in common with other people. We form large. So there's actually a research that was conducted, which says that managers that view projects as unique typically report poorer performance compared to those who recognize and learn from other projects. So I think what we can actually take from this slide is that there's always something to pick up from other projects. And if we don't learn, we will not succeed with our project. There's always something to learn from other previous projects. So the next time you hear your project leader, you hear a project member in your team saying that they are working on a unique project, you need to react. So I think in the next slide, we're going to look at the other bias that's very common in project management. So then when we look at strategic, we're going to look at strategic misrepresentation. So basically, people tend to, like the way information is presented to us can actually influence our decision making. So I'll give you an example. If you walk in a coffee shop and you notice someone that's dressed in a eccentric manner, in an oddly manner, reading poetry, having a cup of coffee, if you were to guess that person, whether that person is an accountant or a poetry or a poet, your initial guess would be that that person is a poet. And that's because the way things are presented to us can actually influence the way we make judgment. Even in reality, there are actually more accountants than poets. So we have stereotypes that influence our decision making. So we're going to look at how these bias manifest in project management. So basically what strategic misrepresentation is, it's a strategic act that exploits biases and heuristics in others for personal gains. And some tend to call it being economical with the truth, and some just call it lying. But the bottom line is that it does raise ethical issues. And we're going to see in the next points, we're going to see how this is used. So basically what happens is that planners, project managers tend to underestimate cost, they underestimate project duration, and overestimate benefits just to secure funding. So you often hear in the project environment people saying that we're going to have to pull down the duration estimates so that the schedule can be approved and the project can start going. And we often see this in larger projects. As you know, project managers and planners, they know that once we start with a project, it's difficult to terminate it, even though it's overrunning in terms of cost and estimates and duration estimates. So in the next slide, in the following slide, we're going to look at some of the ways that these biases can actually be mitigated. But before I continue, I will hand over to Werner to talk about one of the mitigation strategies that could be employed.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, and so just summarizing from what we've had a look at so far, we looked at optimism bias, we looked at uniqueness bias, and we also looked at strategic misrepresentation. And of course, those are interesting things, and I think many of us can relate to that. Many of us have seen that on projects, and we're seeing that every day. And what we've put forward here are three methods from research that have been shown through the research to have a fairly large effect on mitigating those biases and some of those behavioral issues. And the first one that I'll talk about is systemic changes. And what this means is we make changes to our standardized work methods in the organization or on a specific project. Why we do that is we want to limit novel project management approaches. Essentially, that says we don't want the project team on every project to reinvent everything, reinvent procedures, reinvent the way they do estimation, reinvent the way they do reviews or not do reviews at all. So that standardization at organizational level becomes very important, and that we call that a systemic change. And a few examples of systemic changes that are very successful, especially in larger projects, and I think in some instances, some of the items relate to more industrial type projects, is to adopt a front-end loading approach. So if you're not familiar with that, so front-end loading says we go through several stages of studying the project before we actually start implementation. And fundamentally, that says let's spend some money in the beginning to understand the project properly, and before we spend the big money to do the actual project. And I think that California rail line would have benefited from that, because if they had done like a proper front-end loading phase, they would have determined that there are issues with land acquisition, etc. Then the second one is to adopt independent project reviews. And you'll see there are a few times we're going to talk about independence. An independent project review gives you an external view that's not in the project team, so not affected by biases, but Messiah is going to say something about that. Then the third one is to adopt reference class forecasting, which we'll also discuss in a bit more detail. And then the final one that I've just listed here, and there are many more, but the final one is independent and bias-aware qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. So you can't get away from risk assessment. That's always a good way to deal with these problems, and even better so if they're done independently so the person who developed the plan should not be the person reviewing the plan. That's basically what that says. I'm going to hand back to Messiah to talk to the next two mitigating strategies. Messiah.
Okay, thanks, Werner. So we've spoken about optimism bias. We've spoken about uniqueness bias. So what this does is that it feeds to what we call the inside view. So basically, when you see things from this perspective, you are only focusing on specific aspects of the project that you are planning, and you tend to seek evidence in your own experience. And we actually do not want that in project management. So the alternative solution to that is reference class forecasting, which is also referred to as the outside view. So basically, this is the method that we use to predict the outcome of a project or decision by comparing it to a class of similar past projects or decision. Because we maintain that unique projects are actually rare. There is always something to learn from other projects. So if we look at this basic example here, so let's suppose that you are forecasting the cost of a new processing plant, and you pull in your internal resources, your engineers, and then they have an estimate of around 500 million. But however, when you consider external benchmarks, specifically the reference class forecasting approach, historic data indicates that the processing plants of similar size and scope typically exceeds the budget by 40%. Therefore, adjusting for this with this insight, your revised forecast would actually be $700 million. So that's reference class forecasting, looking at similarities from other projects. And then if we move on to the independent project review, so basically this is an objective external assessment of project status, performance, and risk conducted by individuals or teams who are not involved in the day-to-day execution of the project. So basically this is like introducing a devil's advocate to your processes to challenge the team assumptions and plans, and these external assessment can actually provide independent critical thought on the project health, identifying issues or risk, performing pre-mortem of the project, which I will talk about, validate, estimate, scope, schedule, and cost, and risk plans and governance. So going back to the previous point, the pre-mortem. So pre-mortem is basically it was identified by Gary Klein. So basically, what it says is you imagine that your project has failed spectacularly. So you work backwards to identify why your project has failed. So in other words, it's called prospective hindsight. So one of the benefits of this is that it makes it safe for people to raise their concern, and you can actually accurately forecast your outcome by more than 30%. So it actually works. So that brings us to the end of the slides, and then I'll hand over to Werner to conclude or summarize the slides. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Messiah. So thank you for that. And perhaps just to summarize what we've had a look at, we're about 40 minutes in. We looked at optimism bias, we looked at uniqueness bias and strategic misrepresentation. We said those are typical human behavior factors. They're internal to the project team, to individuals who are planners, who are estimators, and they often skew the picture. We end up with estimates and plans that are not very good, not high quality, because of these factors. And we've given you several examples on how that works. There's, of course, a lot of literature on this. There are also other biases, which we didn't mention, but these are ones that come from research to be the most prevalent ones and the ones that have the biggest impact. And perhaps just to mention some of the research into this area, and specifically on strategic misrepresentation, was done by a guy, Bent Flibier, who is a professor at Oxford University. So he's written quite a lot on large cap, or actually mega projects, and also strategic misrepresentation and how that affects large projects. Then we looked at several ways of mitigating these issues. The first one was systemic changes to change the way we work through policies and procedures, methodologies, standard work practices. There's a lot of value in that. Then we looked at reference class forecasting, which is essentially benchmarking. As Messiah explained, there's nothing that is truly unique. We can usually find something in the world that has been done. And the term that is sometimes used there is Lego planning. So like building with Lego blocks to find the components of your project with a history that is well known and that you can use. It's also something, reference class forecasting is often something we can use as part of value engineering as well. And then the last one, independent project reviews, extremely valuable. Those reviews pick up on many issues on the project, from scope all the way through to the risks and the estimates. So that is what we want to conclude with. We'll give an opportunity now. I'm going to hand back to Cyan, and we'll give an opportunity to ask questions. And between Messiah and myself, we'll try our very best to answer your questions. But thanks for this. Thanks for listening. And then also thanks for completing the poll. There are many results here. It is really interesting to see how people behave. So Cyan, thank you very much. I'll hand back to you. And if there are questions, you're welcome to put them to Messiah and myself.
Okay, so we have a question in the Q&A section. So if you don't want to put your name to a question, you can also post it in the Q&A section and post anonymously for anybody that wants to do that. So the question is, we sometimes find that when doing planning, people tend to give time estimates that are in the same range. For instance, every task ends up being 10 or 15 days. Does this link to a bias? Werner, perhaps you can assist with that.
I'll answer, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that actually doesn't link to a bias. It links to a heuristic, and there's a heuristic that's called anchoring. So anchoring heuristic says that it's actually extremely interesting if you read the research on that, but I won't go down that avenue right now. But what happens is, if you are presented with a particular number at the start of your planning, so let us say you open up your project schedule, you're sitting there and you start at some of the tasks, and the first few tasks, they say, okay, this is 20 days, this is 20 days, etc. People subconsciously tend to stick to that number, and all the other estimates tend to be quite close to that because they reference, they actually anchor their estimates back to that number. So anchoring heuristic, which is a mental shortcut, as we said before, it's a quick way to get to the answer. Of course, the difficult way is you actually have to sit and think how long that thing is going to take. It's a lot easier just to jump on the bandwagon of the previous guy and say, yeah, this must also be 20 or 25 or 10 or something like that. So yeah, interesting question. And that is well described in the psychology literature as well. I hope I answered the question.
Great, thanks, Werner. So we've got another question. In your opinion, how can predictive analytics and AI be leveraged to enhance accuracy in project scheduling and eliminate cognitive bias? What would the disadvantages be to include AI to form a balanced approach? So Messiah or Werner, if either one of you want to.
Yeah, I can answer that simply because I've looked at this. I think that using AI and machine learning is wonderful for bringing realism into your estimation process, whether it's scheduling or cost estimation, because it is similar to an independent review. The only challenge that you have with any AI model, and I think that often comes out when we look at project management planning software, is what data that you use to train your model, because all these models must be trained on data. That's how current AI works, is we have big data and that data is used. So if you use global data, then one must be careful just to assume that your project is going to be like that benchmarking is relevant to what you are doing. So that's one of the risks that you have there. But as an independent review mechanism, it is excellent. Where it works particularly well, if you are familiar with estimation classes. So a class 5 estimate is a very high level estimate, and then it goes down to a class 4 estimate, a class 3, 2, and 1. So from around about a class 3 estimate, you actually want to have a work breakdown structure developed. So any estimates higher than that, using AI to give you big data and to give you a benchmarking indication to say, if we're building a building, what should let's say a multi-story building, what is the average cost per floor? And you can provide it with information, and it's going to give you some really good information to benchmark against, at least order of magnitude information. However, when you get down to the specifics of a specific project in a specific location, using a specific workforce, a specific company, that's where the data is not that reliable, because the AI doesn't know your project or your company, unless, of course, you have a lot of data in your company and you could train the models to use your data. Then it is extremely powerful. And in Project Link, we actually have a model that we use for systemic risk assessments, where we used our own data to train a systemic risk model just from historical information. But you actually need lots of data. Okay, hope I answered that, Nicholas.
Cool, that's great. Thank you, Werner. So we've got another question. Does this mean it's crucial to benchmark with similar projects that have been carried out before, whether successful or not?
Okay, I think you definitely want to look at those that were not successful, because that's where you could go, and understanding the reasons. So, whenever you benchmark, you also have to calibrate. So whenever you use data, the trends in the data may be good, but you have to calibrate to your specific situation. So something we often see in machine learning is you can actually train a model and you can get whatever the specific model is that you're using. Sometimes the outputs you get must be calibrated back to what you're doing. So I think using both successful and not successful, just as long as you're able to split the data and you know where the bad data and the good data is, then you can definitely use all the data available. So data is valuable if you understand the context, because not all data is equally valuable.
Correct. So we do have a comment just, I think, on your AI answer, Werner. Someone replied and just said similar issues apply to manual estimates.
Definitely, yeah. Humans are not spared.
Cool. So we have we've got a few more questions actually in the Q&A section. So the next question, how do cognitive biases typically manifest differently in the early and later stages of a project? Monsieur, perhaps you can assist with that.
Okay, no, thanks. No, I think that's a good question. A lot of these biases tend to be stronger in the early stages of the project. And I remember, as an example, the strategic misrepresentation. Remember, the reason why we do it to get approval, to get funding. So that actually happens in the early stages of the project to get that stakeholder buy-in. But you tend to get other biases, especially in execution phase of the project, like your sunk cost fallacy, which is the tendency to continue investing in a failing project. So yeah, that's one bias that you actually tend to see in the later stage of the project. But most of the time, the cognitive bias are more present in the early stages of the project. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Great, thanks, Monsieur. So the next question is, can we attribute China's successes in mega projects to this approach to planning? So maybe you both want to give a comment on that.
So you can go first.
It's a difficult one.
You're on mute. You're on mute. Okay, so I'll quickly comment on that. So I have to say that I'm not perfectly familiar with the way that China does projects, but what I do know, about their market is actually two things. They do many projects, so they have a large database, and I think what is important there is they can calibrate the way they do projects according to their workforce. There's a very specific work ethic, a very specific productivity, and it's quite repeatable within that workforce. So I think there's definitely, well I know for a fact that they do use AI for a lot of their project planning. However, if you go and look at the literature, there are some spectacular disasters in China as well. So they are not consistently successful. So there's definitely room for improvement wherever you go. But yeah, and I think we often don't read much because that economy is fairly closed. We don't read that much about the disasters, but they, I don't think they are much better at performing projects than the rest of the world. Messiah, I don't know if you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, just what you said. I think the most successful projects are the projects that, have, the people in that project learn from what historic data says. So I think if you tend to look at the pattern of, successful projects, you often see that there's actually an abundant amount of data that they've actually quite used to be successful in their project. Yes, I mean, project could fail due to a number of reasons, technology, complexities, but, buyers tend to play a crucial role. And the way we can mitigate this is looking at historic data. So I think if you look at historic data in most projects, you would be most likely be successful.
Great, thanks to both of you for that. So the next question is, how can consultants manage these biases that may lead to underpricing projects during bidding phase in a competitive consulting environment where everyone is trying to win the job and beat the competition?
Well, that's a good question. I'll perhaps just start with that, Messiah. You're welcome to comment on that as well. I think the first thing when you are bidding, you don't want to bid so low that you're not going to make money. That is like the first principle. So if you go into competitive bidding, I think it's always important to bid a fair price and to say to yourself anything below that is not realistic. I think one of the challenges actually comes with that is where you think things are very tight and you are competing is to underestimate. So falling into that trap of thinking everything will go well. And then it doesn't when you get the work. And I think there are so many consulting companies in all aspects, whether it's business consulting, whether it's technical consulting, engineering consulting. I literally deal with companies on a weekly basis where they talk about projects that are not doing well because they were too optimistic going into the planning. So in the project world, I think being realistic is important. And the number one, and Messiah spoke about that, the best way that we know, about is reference class forecasting. Go and look at the past, because the past, specifically in projects, is a very good predictor of what can happen in the future. And I think perhaps the last thing I just want to say there is that if you want to get a bit more mathematical about that, performing something like a quantitative risk assessment, where you look at ranges and distributions and perform Monte Carlo simulations, there's a lot of credibility in that. Of course, if you know how to do them firstly, and if you know how to interpret the results, because then instead of giving an estimate of saying it's going to cost 100 million rand, then you can say there's a 50% chance or a 60% chance of this project costing 100 million or less. at least you've got ranges to work in, and then you know what your risk exposure is. And I think that comes back to more corporate policy, is how much risk are you prepared to take? And if the project goes over, how are you going to fund that risk? And can the company actually do that? So I don't think there's a simple answer to that. There's no silver bullet, but there are methods to understand your risk better.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Werner. Messier, do you have any additional?
No, thanks. Yeah, and I think Werner covered.
Cool. I see a comment was made to say, I tend to agree with Messier and Werner. We never learn from previous projects, good or bad.
Definitely.
Cool. So there are two or three more questions here. So the next question is, well, it's a comment. Mine is a comment on the project I am involved in. My team did not schedule plumbing for the houses to be reinstated to make way for the new N2, with the perception that village houses do not have ablutions in the house. We are now discovering that most properties being reinstated have ablutions in the house, and the oversight has an effect in terms of our pricing and scheduling.
Interesting. A nice example.
Cool, thank you for that. Another question is, where do I study for the side of project management?
Sia, do you want to comment? You're studying at the moment.
So yeah, I mean, it's quite so in the context of project management. So this field is actually under researched. So that's why I'm doing research on this. But it's mostly this field is mostly found in the like finance, behavioral finances. So in project management, it's actually not that it's under researched. So I don't know if Werner, you want to add on something on that point.
I agree with you. So there's not a lot in project specific, even though there is some research on behavioral biases. But because these biases are human and they're not project specific, there's a lot being written about biases in general and heuristics in general. And making the jump, once you look at that, making the jump to project management is not difficult to make. However, to answer your question directly, I don't know of a training course where they specifically train people on behavioral biases as part of project management. In the training that we do look at that as part of actually training in estimation and training in planning and the training in risk management. But we don't have a specific module that just, maybe it's a good idea to develop something like that, but something specific on cognitive and behavioral biases and how to work with that. So yeah, good point. I'll make a note and see if we can maybe develop something like that. We'll advertise it. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Werner and Messier. So the last question is, what's your take on Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 giga projects? Have you guys taken a look?
I'll give an opinion because I've worked in Saudi, actually several times. I think perhaps the simplest answer there is, if you have lots of money to burn, then anything's possible. And I've been looking at some of the projects that they are doing there, the construction projects. I mean, when those guys do things, they really do it at a massive scale. I think one thing that is to their advantage is they tend to, if you've ever worked in Saudi or if you are familiar with that system, actually most of the work, actually I would say nearly all the work, is done by external people, expats. So they tend to get cheap labor from other countries, which of course is fine, but it's not a very expensive place. So they have a lot of money to throw at it, and they get labor in that's not that expensive. Also, having worked in Saudi, I know there's a big drive in Saudi to train their own people as engineers, construction managers, and I think they've been really successful. If I just take from the time that I worked there, several years ago first and where they are now, they're making a lot less use of external consultants. So they've really built in Saudi that knowledge base and the skill set within Saudi Arabia in their own people very successfully. There are several universities. They send a lot of their people overseas to go and study. So I think it's a country that's doing very well in their infrastructure projects, and of course they are also competing with many other countries in terms of attracting business to Saudi and getting people to go to Saudi Arabia. So, and having worked there, I loved working there. It's a bit hot, but other than that, it's actually a great place and great people to work with.
Great,
so I think
thanks,
they'll
Werner.
be successful. Yeah, just the last thing. I think they'll be successful. It will be interesting to watch.
Thanks, Werner. So, yeah, we've actually gone over time here. There is 2 more questions. So if you guys are willing to take them, for anyone that's still holding on, we appreciate you. Just bear with us. So the last question is, well, there's 2 more questions. In your knowledge, can project discovery reduce or increase cognitive biases?
I can just perhaps understand, project discovery, I guess, means different things to different people. So if that person can just post, what do you mean by project discovery? Because it means different things. So I don't want to comment and then I've got the wrong end of the stick in terms of your definitions. Maybe you can just clarify that. There are 2 other questions here that I just want to answer, Cyan, while I'm talking. Is the one is, how does one kickstart a career in project planning and scheduling? And how does one start a career in project planning? So it's a similar question. So in terms of institutions, I think, and of course, I'm a bit biased here. So if you are working in the industrial project field, so if you're working on construction or mining, petrochem, or anything where you build stuff, buildings or infrastructure, plants or stuff like that, I would look at the AACE. It used to be called the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering. So even though they call it cost engineering, it's actually all over project management, but very specific to industrial projects. How do you build stuff? So you can go and have a look at their website. You can just do a search for them on the internet. So I think that's an excellent place to start. They have some training courses. We also have a training course that we present to get you certified as a certified cost professional. So that's a really good way to go. If you're not in that specific industry and you're looking for a bit of a wider spectrum of project management knowledge, then I think a good place to start in terms of international organizations is the Project Management Institute. They have also valuable body of knowledge, lots of information. They've got training courses, but the focus is a bit broader, especially or specifically, they look at IT projects, marketing projects, anything else. They do have construction in there as well, but I would say it's a much broader spectrum, whereas the AACE is very specific in industrial projects, but a lot deeper in that specific area. So those are 2 good places to start. At most universities in South Africa, you can also find courses in project management, project planning. We have some courses that we present from Project Link. So there's a lot of information out there. So I would say the best way to start is do a course in the fundamentals of project management, see if you like that. And then usually through doing that and through the study, whatever you read in terms of textbooks or material as part of a course, there will be additional information that will expand your knowledge.
Great. Thanks for that, Werner. So the person has elaborated on their question.
Okay, yes.
So in your knowledge, can project discovery reduce or increase cognitive biases? The person then has commented and said the initial phase of a project where teams gather critical information and define requirements.
Lucia, do you want to comment on that? I think that is an area that you understand fairly well.
So I think we've concluded that a lot of these cognitive bias actually happen in the initial phase of the project. But I think one of the mitigation strategies that we spoke about is actually the pre-mortem. So what happens is that you gather a team and you know, in the initial phase before the project goes live, and you gather the team, and then you sort of imagine that your project has failed. So that helps you gather more information about the projects, and you tend to discover unknown risk in that process. So yeah, I think this. I don't know if I've answered your question. The initial phase. Yeah, I think that's how I can answer the question. I'm not sure if I answered the question correctly. I think I got carried away.
No, so I think, yeah, so I think the person just wants to understand if doing project discovery would reduce the chances of cognitive biases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, I would also comment on that. I think you know, initially there'll be lots of biases, but if you don't do this, you know, so the question is, what is the alternative? The alternative is to start with execution before you've done proper discovery, you know, and then you're in trouble. If there are biases coming out, then you're in trouble. So I think your discovery phase actually helps you to mitigate your biases, because you can put actually everything we spoke about would be things that we do before we start execution, to make sure when we go into execution, we know what we're doing, and we haven't overestimated our capabilities and underestimated our schedule and budget. So yeah, project discovery is essential. You know, that's where front-end loading comes in.
Okay, great. So the last question for the evening: is it possible to self-assess and objectively quantify one's own bias, and what tools, if any, can achieve this?
I don't know. You know, that little test we did is perhaps one way to see if you are biased, but I think looking at your own history, you know, usually when you look at your own history, it's quite easy to pick up that you were biased, even though you don't recognize it now. You know, because we often look in the past and say, you know, I actually knew that. And once you start saying that, you know, you have some biases. So I don't think, or I don't know of a reliable self-test, like a psychologically solid test and well-researched test to test yourself for biases. So I think that's a safe answer.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's quite challenging to, you know, quantify these things, you know, because they are subconscious, so they sit in the mind. So it's very difficult to quantify this. So I also don't know any test. Yeah.
Great, cool. So that is all our questions.
Right.
Thank you very much, Werner and Messiah, for your guys' presentation and for your insights into all the questions that were asked. And thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one. Hope you have a good evening. We will email you the recording of the presentation with the slides, and you guys can feel free to email us through any questions if you have. Thank you so much again. Hope you enjoy your evening.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much for attending. We appreciate your time. Thanks. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Thank you.